For most of his life, Ron Howard was known as Hollywood's calm center, the polite child star who grew into a director trusted by everyone. He built a career on patience, respect, and quiet leadership. But when he finally spoke about the industry that raised him, his tone changed. The smile faded, the voice dropped, and he revealed a truth that still unsettles people who grew up believing in Hollywood's myths. Howard didn't describe a golden age. He described a polished illusion, one built on silence, intimidation, and protection of the powerful. Behind the legends were behaviors no one dared confront because fame acted as armor and success excused everything. These are the six figures who forced Ron Howard to confront the darkest lessons of Hollywood's past. Errol Flynn, charm as a weapon. To audiences around the world, Errol Flynn was the definition of heroic escape. He wasn't just an actor, he was swagger, danger, and confidence wrapped in a smile. When he exploded onto the scene after Captain Blood, studios didn't just promote him, they built entire systems around protecting him. Flynn became untouchable almost overnight, and that power followed him everywhere. Behind closed doors, however, the image fractured. By the early 1940s, Flynn's private life was spiraling into scandal. Multiple women accused him of behavior that crossed serious moral and legal lines. The courtroom became a spectacle, not a place of accountability. Flynn treated the proceedings like entertainment, joking, smiling, acting as though the outcome was already decided. And in many ways, it was. Studio lawyers mobilized instantly. Witnesses changed stories. Public sympathy shifted toward the star, not the accusations. Ron Howard later admitted that studying Flynn's trial and the private letters that surfaced years later permanently altered how he viewed Hollywood. Those letters showed Flynn bragging about his conquests and mocking the fear he inspired. To Howard, it became clear that charm wasn't just personality, it was a shield. Flynn's fame didn't merely protect him, it silenced others. Flynn's body eventually collapsed under the weight of excess. Years of alcohol, drugs, and unchecked behavior destroyed his health and finances. He died in Vancouver at 50, officially from heart failure and cirrhosis. Howard would later say that Flynn's real cause of death was a lifestyle Hollywood encouraged and rewarded. His downfall became the first warning sign for Howard. When fame protects cruelty, the damage doesn't stop with the victims. It consumes the star as well. Kirk Douglas, rage behind respectability. If Errol Flynn showed Ron Howard how charm could be used as a weapon, Kirk Douglas taught him something even darker, that respectability could hide rage just as effectively. To the public, Douglas represented discipline, moral strength, and hard-earned success. On screen, he played men who fought injustice and stood up to power. Off-screen, many who worked with him described a man who was the power and used it mercilessly. Born as Isur Danielovich to immigrant parents, Douglas rose through Hollywood with sheer will. Poverty hardened him, and success never softened him. By the time Spartacus cemented his status, Douglas moved through sets like a force of nature. Crew members spoke of explosive outbursts, public humiliations, and an atmosphere where everyone walked carefully, never knowing which version of him would appear. He didn't just demand excellence, he demanded dominance. Ron Howard later reflected that Douglas embodied a specific danger of the so-called Golden Age, a belief that suffering justified cruelty. Douglas believed pressure made greatness, and fear was simply part of the process. Actress accounts and industry whispers followed him for decades, describing a man whose temper didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. Stories about his behavior toward women circulated quietly for years, never formal charges but never forgotten either. Silence protected him, just as it protected others. Director Stanley Kubrick, who worked with Douglas, once described him as the most driven man he had ever met, and the hardest to control. That combination became Douglas's legacy. His intensity produced unforgettable performances, but it also left damage behind, damage Hollywood chose not to examine until much later. When Douglas accepted an honorary Oscar decades later, many viewers saw redemption. Howard saw something more complicated, a man still outrunning the consequences of unchecked power. Douglas lived to be over 100, but the conversations around his behavior only grew louder after his death. To Howard, Douglas proved that talent without restraint doesn't elevate art. It poisons the environment that creates it. Faye Dunaway, control without mercy. If Kirk Douglas represented rage justified as discipline, Faye Dunaway revealed a colder, more calculated danger, cruelty disguised as control. To Ron Howard, she proved that harm in Hollywood didn't always arrive shouting. Sometimes it arrived quietly, with precision, humiliation, and an ego sharpened into a weapon. Dunaway was never chaotic in the way Flynn or Douglas could be. She was deliberate. And that made her presence even more unsettling. Her rise was undeniable. After Bonnie and Clyde in Chinatown, Dunaway became untouchable. She carried herself like royalty, and Hollywood rewarded it. But on set, stories accumulated rapidly. Crew members described an atmosphere thick with tension, where one wrong move could trigger public embarrassment. Assistants were reduced to silence. Makeup artists braced themselves. No one relaxed when she was present, because control was her currency. The pattern reached its breaking point during Mommy Dearest. What was meant to be a dramatic portrait of abuse became something far more disturbing behind the scenes. Co-stars later said the fear wasn't just scripted, it was real. Dunaway reportedly hurled objects, screamed at crew members, and halted production repeatedly over lighting, camera angles, and perceived slights. The director later admitted he considered abandoning the project entirely just to escape the environment. Ron Howard would later describe Dunaway as an example of obsession crossing into emotional warfare. Her pursuit of perfection left no room for compassion. On later productions, the stories worsened. Allegations of physical aggression toward crew members surfaced. Entire shooting days were lost not to technical problems, but to emotional damage control. Eventually, her reputation outran her talent. Directors stopped calling. Producers refused the risk. When Dunaway was dismissed from a Broadway production years later, she blamed everyone but herself. Howard commented carefully but firmly that her downfall wasn't sudden. It was the result of a long refusal to recognize others as human. To him, Dunaway became a cautionary figure. Talent without empathy doesn't collapse loudly. It dissolves quietly until no one wants to stand near it anymore. John Wayne, power without question. If Faye Dunaway demonstrated how control could turn poisonous, John Wayne embodied something even more entrenched, authority that no one was allowed to challenge. To the public, Wayne was America's backbone, the cowboy who stood for courage, order, and national pride. But to Ron Howard, learning who Wayne truly was behind the legend shattered the myth completely. Wayne didn't just act powerful roles, he lived as if he owned the space around him. On set, he ruled through intimidation. Crew members recalled being barked at, publicly humiliated, or frozen out if they disagreed with him. Disrespect was treated as treason. Howard later said that Wayne confused fear with leadership, believing dominance was the same as authority. In reality, it created silence, and silence protected him. His behavior went beyond temperament. Wayne openly belittled women, dismissed minority actors, and mocked anyone who pushed against Hollywood's stereotypes. People stayed quiet because confronting him meant losing work. His power wasn't just personal, it was institutional. Studios backed him. Executives deferred to him. The myth of the Duke was too valuable to fracture. The cracks became visible during The Searchers. Director John Ford pushed for moral complexity, portraying Ethan Edwards as a violent, haunted man shaped by hatred. Wayne resisted any interpretation that made the character look morally broken. The final performance left audiences uneasy, not just because of the character, but because the line between role and actor felt dangerously thin. Howard later remarked that watching Wayne made it impossible to tell where performance ended and belief began. Even as culture shifted, Wayne never did. He dismissed critics, rejected reflection, and doubled down on outdated views. When his past statements resurfaced years later, they revealed a man whose worldview had never evolved, only hardened. Wayne died celebrated, but unchanged. To Ron Howard, Wayne became the clearest symbol of Hollywood's most dangerous illusion, that strength excuses cruelty. Wayne proved that when power goes unquestioned long enough, it stops answering to morality altogether. Roman Polanski, genius as an alibi. If John Wayne represented power that was never questioned, Roman Polanski exposed something even more disturbing, a system willing to excuse anything in the name of genius. To Ron Howard, Polanski became the clearest proof that Hollywood's moral failures were not accidents. They were choices. Howard has admitted that he once admired Polanski's work deeply. Films like Rosemary's Baby were studied as masterclasses in tension and control. But admiration collapsed when the truth surfaced. Polanski was arrested in Los Angeles after a private photo session that ended in criminal assault. The evidence was not vague. It was detailed, documented, and undeniable. Polanski ultimately entered a guilty plea acknowledging unlawful conduct, yet before sentencing could be completed, he fled the country. That escape changed everything for Howard. It wasn't just the crime, it was the reaction. Instead of drawing a line, Hollywood froze. Some spoke about art and complexity, others stayed silent. Polanski resettled in Europe, continuing to make films, collect awards, and receive standing ovations while remaining outside the reach of U.S. justice. To Howard, that wasn't neutrality. It was complicity. The moment that hardened Howard's view forever came when Polanski won a major award years later and the room erupted in applause. Howard remained seated. He later said he couldn't separate the celebration from the harm, couldn't cheer while knowing accountability had been abandoned. That applause echoed everything wrong with the system he grew up in, talent elevated above consequence. When protests finally erupted decades later at an awards ceremony overseas, Howard saw it not as cancellation, but as delayed truth. Polanski's case taught him that brilliance doesn't neutralize damage. It often conceals it. Hollywood, in protecting Polanski, revealed its deepest flaw, a willingness to sacrifice victims to preserve prestige. To Howard, Polanski wasn't just one fallen figure. He was evidence that the golden age wasn't broken by scandal. It was built on silence. Mickey Rooney, the smile that lied. If Roman Polanski exposed Hollywood's willingness to protect genius at any cost, Mickey Rooney revealed something even more painful: how the industry could manufacture joy while destroying a human being from the inside out. To Ron Howard, Rooney's story wasn't about monsters hiding in shadows. It was about a lie performed in broad daylight. Rooney was Hollywood's first true child superstar. By the time most people were still finding themselves, he was already carrying the weight of an entire studio system on his shoulders. MGM sold him as the embodiment of happiness, energetic, lovable, endlessly entertaining. Audiences believed the grin, studios profited from it. But behind the curtain, the damage accumulated year by year. Rooney's personal life became chaos disguised as excess. Multiple marriages collapsed under infidelity, gambling addiction, and emotional volatility. Former partners described a man who could charm a room instantly, then turn cruel without warning. Judy Garland, who knew him during the most pressured years of the studio system, later hinted that his behavior added to the emotional burden she already carried under relentless control from executives. Laughter and pain existed side by side, and the audience never saw the cost. As Rooney aged, the illusion collapsed completely. His finances vanished. His career deteriorated. In his final years, he became the victim of financial and emotional abuse inside his own household, forced into court to reclaim basic dignity. When he died, his estate was nearly empty. His body went unclaimed until friends intervened to arrange a quiet funeral. The man who once made millions laugh left the world almost alone. To Ron Howard, Rooney's life was the final confirmation that the golden age ran on exploitation. Children were turned into products, pain was converted into performance, and the audience was taught to clap without asking what it took to create the smile they loved. Rooney didn't just entertain America. He absorbed its cruelty and paid for it in full. Ron Howard never told these stories for revenge. He told them as warnings. To him, the so-called Golden Age wasn't built on magic, but on silence, fear, and people who were protected far too long. So let me ask you, which of these 6 figures shocked you the most? The charming predator, the raging tyrant, or the smiling illusion? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more untold stories from Hollywood's darkest corners, subscribe and stay with us.